Today we're going to talk about the carnivore world's favorite cut of steak. A cut of steak that I think actually gets too much emphasis. If you've seen my recent videos, you know that I actually think you can get just as good of tender, fatty beef from other sources that aren't the rather expensive ribeye, at least expensive most of the time. I know that this video is going live during the summer when we are still seeing $5.99 a pound ribeye steak prices in a lot of parts of the United States. But the ribeye steak is the favorite of the carnivore community, hands down. You go into any carnivore social media group, what do you see people talking about? What do you see people posting pictures of? The ribeye steak. So let's talk today about the anatomy of a ribeye steak. And I've got a couple of different pictures here for you for that. And the first one here, it shows where on the cow the ribeye comes from. You know, the ribeye is going to be surrounded by those rib bones, right? That's why it's called a ribeye, but it's that wonderful cut between the ribs. And here you also will see and on this picture, it shows some of the anatomy of the ribeye, the different parts of the ribeye. But I'm going to use this picture mostly instead. And it shows the 4 different main parts of the ribeye. 5 if you want to count that bone that runs along the bottom end of the steak as it's pictured here. Now this ribeye is pretty close to the ideal actually. If I'm at the store and I see one that's this fatty, we're in for a good time. Because when you're getting into USDA standard and USDA select grade ribeyes, they're going to be a little leaner. If you haven't seen my video on knowing your different USDA cuts of meat or the USDA grading scale, you should check that one out. It's worth your time. That way you can know if you need to actually spend the money on choice and prime or not. That way you have all the information you need to make that decision. Well, let's go over the ribeye here. So like most ribeyes, this picture unfortunately has, most of or at least a good portion of my favorite part of the ribeye cut off. And that's what we call the longissimus costarum. I just call it the pointy end, but because that's the part where most of the time you go to the store, it's been trimmed off. And I'll put a picture of that part up here, right there. That is my favorite part, partially because when I cook a ribeye, it's always raw, or not raw, but it's smoked. I throw it into my pellet grill, and I cook it to about 120 internal temperature. Then I sear it in a cast iron pan, and you get the smoke from the wood pellets. Or the charcoal, if you're using charcoal, gets into the meat, and it's just magnificent. But that's at that front end, and that's often trimmed off. And I really wish the butchers would stop doing that at the store. I will pay the extra, dollar for the ribeye at the store if you leave that part on. I will happily do it. But this is why I buy full ribeye roasts and cut them up myself, because they always have that part intact. Moving to the left on this picture, you'll see what's called the longissimus dorsi. That is that tender eye of the ribeye. That is the eye of the ribeye. And if you've ever gone to Costco and you've seen weird looking steaks that they're calling a ribeye, that's what they've got there, is because they trim the rest of it off when they're weird looking. I'm not saying they always do that. Costco often is famous for having a wide variety of steaks in gigantic packs. But the butchers there will sometimes cut off everything but that part and market it as a ribeye. I have no idea why they do that, why you would do that to a ribeye. I've never seen it personally, but I've seen plenty of photos online, people asking why this is labeled a ribeye, what is this steak? And it is a ribeye. And the reason I've never seen that is because here in the great state of Oklahoma, I think the butchers know better than to do that to a ribeye, because in Oklahoma, we have an official steak of the state of Oklahoma, and that is the ribeye. Good reason to live here, I guess, but they have more common sense than to shred a ribeye steak that way. But that is the sort of the tender center of the ribeye. And most people will say the spinalis dorsi, or the ribeye cap, which is the part moving again leftward, is the best part of the ribeye. Most people say that's the best part. And when Costco is cutting off the outside parts of the ribeye, they're taking that cap and selling it as ribeye cap, as a separate cut of steak. Again, I don't know why they do that. I like the ribeye cap just like anybody else. It is a great part of the steak, but I always say that pointed end, the longissimus costarum, for the end for myself, because it's just so good. And then if you get a good ribeye, a nice full one, you're going to have this tiny little part called multifidus dorsi. It is a very tender part, separated by a wall of fat from most of the rest of the steak, but it does connect here to the longissimus dorsi. It is the sort of connective tissue for the particular muscle that is the ribeye steak. So I'm curious though, for you, what is your favorite part of the ribeye? Are you do you like that pointed end, the longissimus costarum, like I do? Are you a fan of the spinalis dorsi? Do you just like taking that bone on a bone-in ribeye and just gnawing on it afterwards? You get all the connective tissue and the trace amounts of meat off. And one thing I keep hitting on here about this, and I know I've already mentioned trimming on these, but your ribeye is going to look very different, probably from store to store based on how the butcher is trimming it. Not only will you may or may not have that pointed end trimmed off, which annoys me greatly, but you may also find the thickness of the steak is different store to store. Have you ever seen a 2-inch thick ribeye that wasn't a tomahawk ribeye in the store? Probably not. By the way, the difference between a tomahawk ribeye and a normal bone-in cowboy cut ribeye, because that's what that picture is a cowboy cut ribeye where that little bit of bone is going to be the thickness of the steak and by consequence the thickness of the bone. Because you notice on a cowboy cut ribeye, that bone has also been cut. You can actually see into the bone. The old marrow is actually visible. Well, a cowboy cut ribeye is going to be an extra thick ribeye, 2 inches, maybe 3-inch thick. I bought a cowboy cut ribeye, or I bought a tomahawk ribeye rather, once from Sam's Club for marked down to $20. Got a Sam's Club scouting grocery haul video in the works, by the way, for you. But I bought one once, and it was $20, and it was like 2.5 inches thick. The thing weighed like 3 pounds. It was glorious. When you took the bone out of there, it was about 2.5 pounds. It was still a lovely steak, and yes, I did manage to finish it in one sitting, and I ate something small the rest of the day, towards the end of the day, because that steak carried me the whole day, despite a hard, brutal workout that morning. But if you buy a cowboy cut ribeye with that bone, or a normal ribeye, which is what you see in most stores without that bone, there will still be some trimming differences. So you may have a hard time if you pick up a steak in front of you identifying all those parts, simply because of the whims of the butcher. And then, of course, on that cowboy cut ribeye, it should be easier because those tend to be the least trimmed. They're most likely to still have that pointed end, but that can also still, even on a cowboy cut ribeye, get removed because the butcher trimmed up that bone. Because what you're looking at there, that bone is a rib bone. And one of these days I'm going to make a video showing you my favorite thing, one of my favorite things to barbecue that I don't do very often because it's just not the cheapest thing. And those are beef fat. These are going to be the beef plate ribs. Those are like the dinosaur bone ribs, right? You've seen pictures of Texas barbecue where you've got the giant bone with a huge chunk of beef on it. That's beef plate ribs. They're the kings of Texas barbecue, basically, after the brisket. And they often get called brisket on a stick for a reason. And so you're talking, a big bone, not from that cut of the beef probably, but it's still a fairly large bone. And if you buy a tomahawk ribeye, make sure to save the bone, or a cowboy cut ribeye, or a T-bone, or anything. Save that bone, put it in your bone bag for bone broth. I recently made a batch of bone broth recently, and the only error I made was accidentally leaving a little bit of fat, a little too much fat into the mix, and so now all my jars have like a little layer of fat on the top, which is fine. Take a spoon, break that stuff off, put it in the pan, let it, help it to use it to reseason the pan. Curious what your favorite part of the ribeye is, or if you're just like, I don't care, I'll eat the whole thing. Let me know in the comments. Please like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help channels like this grow. Share this on social media if you want. It's a little bit of a lighter, fun video compared to the things I did in the last few days. And as always, thanks for watching today.